Now we've wandered round the Sisley's home and seen their world and delved into a little of the history of Eastbury. Now I can't take you to the Sisley's other homes. Clement Sisley was a gentleman and a man of means. He had property in London, in Queenhithe, all of which was wiped away in the Great Fire of London. The parish, and the parish church, rather, in which they worshipped in London, was never rebuilt after the Great Fire. So that's where they would have worshipped when they were in London. Their home and their parish church, many years after they died, would have been completely wiped away, so I can't take you there. They also had property in East Ham as well. Now, before Eastbury here was built, they were deviating between East Ham and London. So East Ham would have been their country home, London obviously their city home. And when Eastbury was built, this became their predominant country home. As you can well imagine, the expense that was spent on it. So I can't take you to those other homes, but we were lucky enough to have a look around this one. There are no images or portraits surviving or known of the Sisleys from their era that are known of in our time, but let me introduce you to them. This is the actor that plays Clement Sisley at the house. Now, Clement Sisley was born in the early 1520s, so an interesting time in English history, the reign of Henry VIII. He would have been a young lad and a young boy going through the Reformation, so he would have well remembered that, and quite probably seen the tearing down of Barking Abbey, it must have been quite a big thing. So there are no hints or anything that he remained a Catholic after the Reformation. He didn't break any of the recusancy laws. He attended Barking St Margaret's church like a good Protestant. When they were living at East Ham and then Eastbury, Barking St Margaret's was their place of worship. So like we were able to visit the house, we will also visit there and see the links to that as well, but that's further on in the video. As I say, Clement was born in the 1520s and he died in August 1578. This is his wife, Anne Argyll. Now there was a big age gap between Clement and Anne, of around 25 to 28 years. Anne was born in 1547, the year that King Henry VIII died. She was a wealthy young lady. Her father, as we discovered when we toured the house, was a minister to the king and high up in that line. Clement we think of as Barking's Bess of Hardwick, because with all of his marriages, his 3 marriages, he went up in the world with each one. Because don't forget, in those days, when a man married a woman, her property then became his. So he married his first wife, then his second wife, Maud, which is where we'll pick up on. And then this is his last wife, his young wife. And this is the actress that also plays her at the house, and a very pretty young lady she is as well. So that's the Sisleys. Now we go into a little bit of what life, marriage, birth, death and burial would have been like in their age. If you remember well, you see this here: you are cordially invited. Eastbury Hall was likely to have been the venue for the wedding party of Clement Sisley's daughter Mary, when she married Abacut Harmon at St Margaret's Church in August 1571. The great hall would have been decorated with flowers as the proud parents welcomed their guests. This is the image that's shown in the house of a typical Tudor wedding feast. They were much of a muchness in those days. In a gentry house, this is very much what you would have got. But here is an image actually from the time, a woodcut, of a Tudor wedding, round about the era of when Clement would have married his 3rd wife, which was in the 1560s, and when his daughter married her husband, which was in the 1570s. because Mary, his daughter, who married Abacuc Harmon, the third wife, Anne Argyll, she would have been the stepmother, and there wouldn't have been great many years difference between the two of them, really. So this is your typical Tudor wedding, and the wedding ceremonies, the christenings of Clement's children, and the funeral and burials all would have been performed by the one man, Reverend Richard Tyrwhitt, who was Reverend of Barking from 1560 to 1580. So after they'd had their wedding, back to the house they would have gone, including the Reverend, for their lovely wedding feast. So that's your marriages in Tudor eras. And this is very much what like a feast like that would have been. This is a recreation in our own time. And as we learned in the house, the family would have sat on a dais at a top table, and that's what you see at the top here with the guests at the other tables. You were seated in order of your importance. The salt was a very precious commodity in those days, as well as being fairly valuable. It preserved food, and the most important guest would always be seated near to the salt. And this is your archetypical Tudor wedding feast of the era. You've got your spiced cake, your sweetmeats, your marchpane, and a beautiful wild boar's head with marzipan tusks in the middle. Absolutely revolting to our eyes. Well, the boar's head is anyway. But this is pretty much what your gentry would have been enjoying in those days. And Barking, as I've said in our pocket history of Barking and Dagenham, when you do see it, the market at Barking was well supplied. Eastbury was very much self-sufficient with its food produce and things that it produced, and the meat and stuff like that as well. Luxuries, of course, would have been bought in from the markets, which would have been bought up from London. So that's your marriages. And now to births and christenings in that era. Very much like death, it was a very hands-on process, and dealt with in the home was birth. Whether a poor woman or a rich woman, you would have had a midwife of some degree, family members and servants. The birthing chamber was a female-only zone in those days. Men would have been kept well away. The birth would have occurred. The lady would have had to be churched. I think it was after about 14 days, which cleansed her of the sin of childbirth. And Clement, when he married his young wife, he was in his 50s and she was in her 30s. Now, come 1577, thereabouts, when he sired this child with his young wife, he was in his late 50s. So he was obviously still active enough. They would have had their child at Eastbury, and then they would have gone to Barking to christen her. We'll be seeing a little bit more of that as we go through the original documentation. Childbirth was a dangerous, perilous thing in those days. Obviously, of course, for the woman. We had none of the luxuries in that degree that we think of nowadays. Back then, no antibiotics. If a child was stuck inside the womb or breech or something, nowadays we've got so many things, including caesareans, which did not exist in those days. I mean, the first successful caesarean where mother and child lived was many years after the Sisleys. And there are accounts when it happened to Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. She was a young lady, a young girl actually, when she had him. And there are accounts of the times of many women where a child got stuck inside, and the midwives, they would lay you on a sheet and then they would toss you in the air to hopefully make the child turn and come out. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Luckily with this child, everything seems to have gone okay. Now we come to the sadder part of life, and in this case death, in the Tudor era. We rely on an AI generated image here, I don't often rely on them that much now, but I can with this one because we know from the accounts of the house, which are very good, they kept good accounts, the Sisleys, that the Sisleys had a Spanish four-poster bed. So here we see Clement Sisley in 1577 in his four-poster bed, and the accounts from the time and the household accounts, which are kept at the Chelmsford Archives, and there are some at the National Archives as well. The apothecary's bills still exist, and the apothecary was brought in from Barking, and a lot of the remedies on the apothecary's bill were for fevers and things to bring down fevers and to calm fevers. So it was pretty much an odds-on that he died of a fever. The burial record pretty much, well, not pretty much, does confirm that for us. And it's unusual to have a cause of death in those days, and it's only because of his social status that that was actually recorded down, as we will see. But here we see Clement in his bed, and with the apothecary nervously standing by, waiting and watching. And one of the disgusting things about apothecaries and doctors in those days, and Clement had a physician as well, the physician was brought in from London, so it would have been an expensive one, how they would tell the health of their patients was to get them to piss. And then they would taste the piss, and they believed that they could tell what was wrong with a person by what they called the four humours, which was yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and something else, something colic, I think. And this was an ancient theory from the Greeks. They believed in the four humours, and you would either be bled or leeched or given some pretty nasty remedies and treatments. None of which unfortunately worked for Clement, obviously. His death appears to have happened quite rapidly. It doesn't appear to have been a gradual decline. And the fact that a year before his death, a year and 2 months before his death, in his late 50s, approaching 60s, he was able to sire a child, suggests that he was in relatively good health up until the end. Fevers and illness could come and go quickly in those days. As an old tableau went, a man might be merry at breakfast and dead by supper, and that was associated with the sweating sickness, through which Clement Sisley would have lived as well. The sweating sickness of the 1520s and 30s was a terrifying illness. It scourged away whole households within a day or two of each other, where you would be well at breakfast and you would get so hot and sweat so much that your body would foul and you'd be dead by dinner time. So yeah, dangerous times. And Clement went between London and Essex, and London was a filthy place, so he may have caught his fever there. And death, as with birth, was very much a hands-on process in those days, dealt with in the home. It was rare for a person to be taken to an infirmary or the hospitals that did exist in those days. And don't forget, with the going of the abbeys went many of the infirmaries, which were not replaced until the poor law unions and workhouse infirmaries came in many years later. So Clement died at home, and he would have been dealt with at home. And from information from my friends at Barking Church, we know that a lot of the pre-1600, pretty nearly all of the pre-1600 burials inside and outside the church were all buried in shrouds rather than in coffins, which was quite common in those days. William Shakespeare was buried in a shroud and not a coffin. Those scanning machines that they done on his grave recently discovered that one, and he was a very wealthy man, like Clement. So Clement would have died at home. The vicar of St Margaret's would have been sent for and would have given him his rights. Then the family would have been there. He would have died, and the servants or the close family members would have washed and cleaned his body. It's highly unlikely that a man as wealthy as he was would, like Clement, would have been embalmed back then. It was for the extremely wealthy, and he lived very near a church as well, a mile away. So this is pretty much how Clement would have looked at the end. It's not a pretty sight, I know, but this is how most of our ancestors and forebears of that era went to their graves, the winding sheet. And every parish in those days had its bier, its funeral bier, not in a drink of beer, B-I-E-R. And Barking parish, like every other, had its funeral bier, and when someone died, rich or poor, the bier would be sent for and the body would be laid on the bier. And it was, in those days, classed as an honour to carry a gentleman or a headman to his funeral, and they lived a mile away from the church, and the funeral procession would have gone on foot. Being a gentleman, as of the Tudor and Stuart eras, a lot of their funerals occurred in the evening, and being inside the church, that would have been more convenient because it would have been well lit. So this is a Tudor era funeral of a gentleman, and Clement, of course, being a gentleman, he would have been laid on his bier, and he would have been covered in a black pall. In front of the bier, someone would have walked with his coat of arms. That was the ultimate status symbol of those days. That proclaimed who he was and that he was actually a somebody. And they made their way from Eastbury to Barking along the Ripple Road. And with the old maps and this map here that shows the house as it was in those days, I'll be able to show you that journey. I was going to do it on foot in our own current time, filming, but I did a recce of it beforehand and decided that, in Clement Sisley's words, if I did such a thing, I would probably be waylaid by highwaymen. Utes in this day and age, but yeah, I don't wish that to happen, so maps it is. So, join me for that part now. And here we are. This is the little image from that amazing panoramic that we saw of the Sisley's home as it was back in their day. And here we see it again. And we pick up on the journey of Clement Sisley on the way to his funeral. Not only for him on the way to his funeral, but you have to remember, every time that the Sisleys went to church, it would have been every Sunday for a christening, a marriage, a burial, either of their own or their friends. Also for the Barking fairs and markets, which rich and poor attended, they would have had to make this journey. So, watch for the little circles which will appear. This is that track that joins onto the Ripple Road, and as we learned in the house, the Ripple Road skirts the Eastbury estate, and the Ripple Road is a very, very old road, older than Eastbury itself. So you've seen the little circle there, that's where they would have come out from their side gate, along their track, and onto the Ripple Road to Barking. Now, to carry on our journey, we have to move over to another map, a slightly later one, which will take us from here, pick us up from here, and into Barking. And here we are. This is a slightly later map. This is the very early 1600s, but not much has changed between 1570s and the 1600s at this period. I'll mark off Eastbury again with a circle. There is Eastbury, and the Ripple Road skirts around Eastbury, so we're going to be carrying on with the Sisley's journey, and we have to imagine that a mixture of very well-dressed gentry and gentlemen, friends of the Sisleys, family of course, children who would have come, and also the poor, because in those days, and this is in Clement Sisley's will, he left money and provisions for the poor, and for black gowns to be provided for them, and for a funeral feast afterwards. So the funeral is more than likely, and I've been told this by history friends and people who know a bit more than I do as well, is more than likely to have taken place of an evening. So you can imagine a torchlit procession leaving Eastbury, and the road skirts round. So there's Eastbury, and they've just gone onto the track, and they mark their way along the Ripple Road, past another estate called Westbury, a lost estate, as we learned about in the video, in the tour of Eastbury Manor House. Carry on with their journey and ours, and they get into Barking town centre. So a short journey of a mile. Wouldn't have taken them very long either. Would have been quite solemn, of course. They wouldn't have rushed or run or crossed roads and crossings and lights like I did. So, and the countryside would have been very different. This would have been a track and not a flyover and a council estate and everything like that. Do excuse the chiming clock. It's 12 o'clock. Yep, that's it. That's done. I think that's said its word. Yeah, so they're in Barking now, and they would have arrived at the curfew gate through which we can still walk. The vicar would have come out and met this gentry funeral and its procession. But before we go into the church, which is where you're going to join me, I want to show you some of the original documents that tie our Sisleys to Barking St Margaret's. And for the first time ever, you're going to join me inside an archives for the filming inside an archives at Barking and Dagenham Archives, and the mystery of the missing marriages. That's why we can't find the exact date that Clement Sisley and Anne Argyll married, and we know they married at Barking St Margaret's, but there are several years of missing marriages. So, on to that part now. But before we go in and see the Sisleys, in a manner of speaking, inside the church, I'll show you some documents that tie our Sisleys to this place. And an interesting little thing that we've come across, me and the archivist. Today, you'll join me for this little bit from Barking and Dagenham Archives. I was very kindly granted permission to film this as well, which is fairly unusual for an archives. So, but what we discovered is that the marriages at Barking, they jump from 1561 right to 1568. That's it. There's no 1562, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. We can't explain it. The archivist can't explain it. I couldn't explain it. This is what we found. Goes from 1561 to 1568, right at the very top of the page, then to 1570. So where did those missing 7 years go? Our next port of call after this was transcripts, so that's what you'll join me for now. Good evening, ladies and gents. You join me from the inner lair of London Luke. Now this is the transcripts and the mystery of the missing marriages. As you can see, it jumps straight from 1560, goes from 1561, it jumps straight from 1561 there to 1568. So where did those missing 7 years go? That's what needs to be looked into, because it's very interesting. And we know the Sisleys were at the church at this time because obviously Clement Sisley's daughter, Mary Sisley, married Abicook Harmon in 1571, and that's recorded in the transcripts. And we also know that Clement's second wife, Maud, was buried at the church in 1562, which predates his last marriage and all this lot. So where that missing 7 years have gone, we do not know. So yeah, that's the transcripts and that little bit. And now on to our next document, which is the oldest, and which predates Eastbury and the marriage of Clement Sisley to Anne Argyll. This is August 1562, and this predates Eastbury and the marriage of Clement Sisley to Anne Argyll. This is his second wife, Maud. Now, in those days, to be called Mr. or Mrs. meant you was a little bit of a somebody. It seems funny to us because we're all called that, but if you notice, all the others are called John, Joan, Mildred. But here, Mrs. Sisley, buried ye 1st day of August 1562. So that's Clement's second wife, and she's buried inside the church. They were living at East Ham at the time that this death occurred. So yeah, that's our earliest document. And now on to our next one. Marriages this time, something a little bit more cheerful. August 1571. So in between this time, Clement Argyll had lost his second wife and married his third. Anne Argyll, Clement Sisley, had lost his second wife and married his third, Anne Argyll, at Barking St Margaret's. But this is the marriage of his daughter and son-in-law. You've got August 1571, Abercoke Harmon and Miss, notice that again, Mary Sisley. Married ye, and he's done it in the Latin, but it's 13th day of August. So that's their marriage, and performed and whatnot, and off they would have gone back to Eastbury for their lovely wedding feast. And on to our next document. And another cheerful one, and a slightly amusing one as well. This is June 1577, so just 1 year and 2 months before Clement died, and he would have been in his late 50s at this time. And here you have the birth and christening of his last child, Anne, daughter of Mr. Clement Sisley, Esquire, baptised ye 7th of July. So this, in Tudor times, 58, you would have been considered old. So this elderly man and his young 30-something wife, they've had their last child, or his last child certainly, at least anyway. So that's July 1577, and the birth of young Anne. So they would have christened their child, and off they would have gone back to Eastbury again. And now on to our last and final document. Note I use the word final because you don't get more final than this one. And it's September that he died. I think I said August earlier. If I did, I correct myself. It's September. September 1578. This is burials. Note the final. You don't get more final than this one. And we go down the list to Clement Sisley, Esquire. And this is the unusual bit, because they don't note causes of death for anyone else or call them Mr. Died of fever, and he's buried ye 9th of September. So that's Clement Sisley. That's the end of our man there. He's buried, and his wife Anne had him buried neatly in with his second wife Maud. And these are the documents that tie our Sisleys to Barking St Margaret's, and that's where you're going to join me now. You're going to join me inside, and we'll see where the Sisleys christened, married, and eventually were buried. We can visit that grave. So come along with me to Barking St Margaret's, and we'll say a goodbye and pay our respects to the Sisleys. Off we go. I hope you all found those interesting, the documents or evidence that links the Sisleys to this place. Now we will go in, and we'll take the journey that they would have taken for church services, christenings, marriages, burials. And that's not chimed the hours and halves for quite some time. It's recently up and going again, which is nice. One of the old main doorways into the church. This one would have been for church services and high days and holidays, for very special occasions. would have gone in through this door, through the bell tower, under the baptistry where Clement would have christened his children, and into the church. And you, ladies and gents, are going to join me on the opposite side of this door inside the church, so join me there. And here we are inside the church where Clement Sisley would have christened his children, married, his daughter got married, and where he lies buried with his second wife, Maud, sorry. And we saw the door from the outside, which is behind this curtain, but the original door they would have come through into this way through the baptistry. To get married, they would have gone down the aisle. The church would have been very different in their day. The wooden ceiling, the wooden roof, that's from the 1520s, and that would have been in place in Clement Sisley's time. And right up there you can see the traces of the medieval Tudor era painting, which was part of a doom scene which was all taken down after the Reformation. So that would have been much brighter in Clement's day, and that's what these are. So they would have walked down the nave under this wooden ceiling. Through the high altar, or to the high altar, where they would have married. Flagstones, and this is where they would have stood when they married. So Clement Sisley and Anne and Mary, his daughter, and Habakkuk, his son-in-law, we can trace them to this spot, which is interesting. Christenings would have taken place in the baptistry, which is just there, but this font is 1580s, so it's later than Clement's time, but that's where the original font would have been, and his daughter that he sired when he was an old man would have been christened there. And at the very end, the slightly sad bit, this is where Clement Sisley lies. His wife Anne had him buried with his second wife Maud. She died in 1562, is buried here. And there you see, the brasses are gone, long gone unfortunately, but there's Clement, and there's his wife Maud, and there would have been the coats of arms, and this little figure here is a child. So it shows that there is a child of theirs buried in this tomb as well. So that's Clement Sisley's last resting place. Hope you've all found this interesting. Thanks very much for watching.